So call it Restaurant 2035. So the first thing is, what actually drives innovation? It's not cool factor, right? Cool factor is the secondary when something cool happens, but social changes drive technology innovation, right? Accessibility, people with special needs, dietary needs, disabilities, they drive technology innovation. And the third is economics. Now, the interesting part about this, they're ranked. The most important one is economics, right? As you look at all the data, if what you're building doesn't have an economic model, it doesn't support unit economics in the restaurant space, it's not gonna be viable. It might be cool, it gives me a virtual reality picture of my food on the table, but I can't monetize it. It doesn't create any value. So there's a balance between cool and actually effective. So I'm gonna fly through the first two quick because they're not what I'm gonna focus on, but I'm gonna focus on the economic one the most today. So social changes are reflected in different things like how we eat, right? The actual, do we sit at the table and eat, or do we eat it from a container or in the car or while we actually jog? Is it shareable plate? And then what we eat, is it healthy food? Is it vegan, vegetarian, pescatarian? Whatever diet is currently happening. And then where do we eat? It used to be a table and then became the living room. Then in restaurants, it became to go and eat in the car again. And there's all these changes that affect how we treat food in a world of social interactions as well, right? We're more lonely now when we eat than before. We most of the time eat alone. So that's an interesting information. And then when? The traditional day parts have been broken, right? We have snack times, we have late night, extra late night. We do it while we watch movies, we do it while we see a game. Not anymore junk food. We can get gourmet food. If you go to see the Mavericks here in town, ribs. I mean, they got all kind of things and quality products, and it's pretty incredible. But the most interesting one, while we work, is very, very popular. People eating at their desks is a very, very common thing now in change. And then the technology that affects how the social part is, right? How do we order food? It used to be just conversational. If it's a server or a cashier, and then you look at innovation through technology from a kiosk, a phone, a website, a third-party app. These are just highlights. There are hundreds of these things you can list. And then experiential, right? So what do we do? Do we look, again, like I said before, social venues? Can I combine things like what Anne said? I'm going to a museum while I eat, different things I'm trying to do while I eat. And an omni-channel, right? There's a no technology approach, right? Call, very basic low tech. There's more of a branded provided technology. There's technology aggregators. There's so many ways you can place orders now and communicate your needs and capture that data. It's an interesting space. And then privacy, right? People are very concerned. They hear about breaches. They know about their personal information. They're worried about privacy. You deal with PII and GDPR and CCPA and whatever term comes out tomorrow that makes us pay lawyers more money, right? So there's all these things that affect and create need for different technology. Now, Anne touched on age, and that's a very, very important factor when you talk about the social aspect. We are an aging nation, right? If you actually look at the data, by 2035, we'll have people that are more adult, we'll have a society that's more adult than children. And that changes, right? You're focusing completely differently. And what's driving population is also interesting. If you look at the year 2030 to 2040, there's a drastic shift, right, between birth and migration, right? Most of our population growth will come from migration, not from birth. And that means ethnic changes, cuisine changes. It means a lot of things will happen, right? It's going to change the palate. It's going to change a lot of things that will drive different innovations. It also brings different styles of dining, more community dining, depends what country they come from. So there's a whole aspect here that's going to affect technology on the baseline data. Now looking a little bit at the delivery revenue, you can kind of see the $22 billion industry, going to go up to about 28. They're not projecting much beyond that. And the reason they're not projecting it much beyond that, as I go through these slides, we'll talk about market penetration, we'll talk about the age group that actually are buying, because that's a big reason why they're not growing those numbers as fast as you think they would. So penetration, average spend, you can see the two lines represent the people that order directly from you and the people who order through an aggregator or a third party. Again, you'll have access to it. But the age is interesting. So if you look at that, right, it kind of ages out a little bit, right? You've got a big segment, the 18 to 24 and the 25 to 34. Now, the reason they're curving down the projections a bit is that 18 to 24. Those are college students, at-home youth. So they have a high disposable income in ratio to actual expenditure of cost of living. But as they mature out, those numbers might change. So you have this 20% group that won't necessarily curve up to the 37. It might actually dip for a while, and that line will keep moving. That 37 will move to a 35 or 44, and so on. So there'll be a shift, and not necessarily a lot of growth on that left. So they're very cautious right now in the amount of projections they're doing to the overall growth. They're going to wait out. And then the gender, it's almost a split. I mean, there's a 10% delta, obviously, but it's close to a split. There's not necessarily big things there. Income, obviously, the biggest driver, right? So you're going to the high income mostly, mid to high income. No surprise there, again. But it is driving some of the technology innovation. So what is it doing to restaurants is, if you think about technology status quo, you've got a floor plan, you've got a few point-of-sale stations, an area you can actually place orders, and you've got passive order takers like servers. And the kitchen stress pretty much comes from them and some third-party and online orders. But it's a very manageable flow-through. We're evolving more and more into a model that every team member has technology that they can also maybe take tableside ordering and things like that. So we're going to stress a little bit more the kitchens as we speed up, seating to production to dining. Somewhat controllable still with the current kitchens we have. But this is what's happening with consumers, right? Everybody has a connected device. And as demands increase and consumers want more, we're going to see an evolution towards, I want to use my own device to do more while I'm here. Can you imagine the kitchen that happens at 12:15 at lunch? That's not sustainable, right? So these are the things that will affect technology and how people want to interact. And we'll get to some of the technology in a bit. So there's a couple of conclusions here. The takeaways really is you're going to have to invest a lot more in culinary innovation. Right? You're going to have to adapt to, again, palette changes and age changes. You'll have to talk about store remodeling cycles. As the kitchen is stressed differently, as the dining room is used differently, as drive-thrus and delivery, it's going to affect a lot of the remodeling. Staying relevant affects remodeling, but there will be a lot of remodels. They touched on it in the prior panel, but there will be a drastic shift. I wouldn't have drawn it as a big drive line. I would have drawn it as a very large kitchen with a very small dining room, because the stress on the kitchen is only going to increase. So again, you can read through these, but those are some of the conclusions from the study. And then we talk about accessibility. Now that's an interesting one, because we tend to, at least in the back of our head, look at accessibility as a small part of society, something that, there's some people have disabilities, some people have dietary needs. It's actually not that small, and when we talk about that, we'll talk why it's important. So we broke them into groups of allergies, people that just can't eat because of certain allergies and need special assistance, dietary, disability, and access. So the numbers are kind of staggering if you actually think about it. 1 in 4 Americans have a form of disability, right? That's pretty high. You wouldn't think that, but it's that high. And when you combine that with some overlap with people who have food allergies at 32 million, it's roughly 10% of the population. So let's assume there's some overlap. There's no study to say how much overlap, but let's assume there's some overlap. We're basically dealing with about 30% of society. That's a big segment, and technology can play a bigger role in their participation in restaurants. Somewhat untapped. Today we do what ADA tells us to do. But the question is, can we do more to drive them having more access to our products in our restaurant? And I think a lot of innovation, as I talk about it, will be towards that, the inclusion. We have this thing right now that we don't want to leave anyone behind, and that's a great thing, but that means technology has to evolve for that and accommodate the needs. Some of it comes in the term of personalization, some of it is a bit more extensive. So again, takeaways, investment in accommodation of special needs, and things like that. Now, the big one is going to be economics. Money talks, right? That's the reality of it. So what drives the economic decision is quite interesting. So we've got unit economics we have to deal with. At the end, you want to operate a profitable business. unless you start as a nonprofit like 80% of restaurateurs. But most of it, you want to be a profitable business. So first of all, you got to look at commodity. So there is an increase in commodity prices, slow creeping increase. It's not slowing down. Beef obviously has taken a big hit and will continue. More demand on the food supply, more people dining, more population growth in general, not just in the US, just increases the price. It's more expensive to harvest, it's more expensive to produce, it's more expensive to ship. It's going to continue to rise. So that's driving decision technology. The minimum wage movement, right? It's going to continue trickling in. I mean, California ramping up to $15. 10% of all restaurant sales in the country last year came from that state. So even though it's one state, it does affect the whole supply chain and everything around it. And if you add the rest, the minimum wage states that are higher than the federal make up over half at this point of the total sales in the industry, with the yellow ones representing close to 40%. And then you look at how people spend food at home or takeaway. Now, the interesting is, if you look at the graph with the yellow and blue, if you look at the year 2000, which is close to the 2014, there's not a drastic overall shift in total spend, right? The graph has not drastically shifted. That is continuing. The overall spend of an individual is not growing by much. What is shifting is where they're spending their money, right? Between buying raw ingredients and cooking, or actually ordering food. Now, this chart goes to 2014. In 2015, we had a landmark year. People started spending more in restaurants than actually buying groceries. That trend is still growing, and that's going to affect. But we're at over 50% now spent, which leads to the next is what's the share of wallet of food services. It's about 36 cents of every dollar that you spend ends up going to the food services. The rest is about plant processing and farming and so on. But if I spend $1, 36 cents of it is going to stay in the restaurant space. Now, that's an interesting one. So if you actually look at that, your buying power is constantly shrinking. We keep taking price to fight labor. We keep taking price to fight commodities and all the other factors, gas prices. And we're at the point right now that it's 3.5 times more expensive to eat in a restaurant on average than buying the raw ingredients and doing it on your own. That leads to a conclusion we'll talk about, that we might be pretty much edging into how much price we can take. And when you see that in comparison to income, it becomes obvious. If you look at the last, basically from 2010 to 2017, adjusted to inflation, the median household income has only climbed by 2.6%, vastly outpacing the spend that they have to buy food outside. That's not a good indicator on how much price can you still take before consumers have to make drastic decisions, because if you go 3 slides back, the overall spend is not growing much. It's just the distribution. So if we're not careful and not continue increasing price too much, we might drive a reverse trend of going back into cooking. And we don't want that in this industry. So combine that with factors that affect technology, like low unemployment and a very, very flat population. I mean, we're opening more and more restaurants. There are more seats. I saw different figures. I don't know if there's a strong number we can put our hat on. The best number I could find is somewhere around 8%. I'm not sure it's accurate, but 8% more seats to actually dine in every year. And that's not good when you're not growing the reach of how many people you can actually sell food to. So that's something to watch on what's going to drive technologies. So I'm going to jump a little bit from it, is what's going to happen, what's going to stick. So I picked a few favorites, and for the sake of time, I'm really going to cover a few of those. I'll talk about all the areas that I haven't covered here and why I didn't cover some of those. But let's talk about some major predictions for 2035 based on that. So some of those might be pretty obvious. Voice. I mean, why is voice not there today? Well, there's noise cancellation technology you have to worry about. A loud restaurant, how do you place an order? You've got scenarios where you have an accent like myself, or you just don't speak well like myself, or you stutter not like myself. So you've got scenarios like that, and technology is getting better and better. It's not within 5 years for in-house. I've been tracking the technology. What you learn in technology is you can get to 92% accuracy or positive translation, and that sounds great. We're only 8% away. Every 1% is exponentially harder to achieve, and at the end of the day, you can't remake 8% of the food because the voice is not capturing correctly. Now, on the phone with a mic, much easier. In a lot of restaurant, in a lot of venue, there's still ways to go, but if we fast forward 15 years from now, this is our most natural interface, right? It has no filters, we all know. We say right away what we want. It doesn't require thinking, then communicating. The philosophy in general is everything between our mouth and the person making our food is friction at that point, right? So there'll be a lot of things towards reducing that friction, and it helps the labor model as well. But it also helps accessibility. It's a winner because what do you do with people that have different disabilities and can use voice to better communicate? And some disability can be as simple as social anxiety. And then you talk about the labor market. So there's a lot of innovation happening in the 3D printing space in the kitchen. Labor models now making it that the unit economics will be there in the next 4 or 5 years, where there'll be more mainstream application of actually 3D printing in the kitchen. I still think it's about 15 years out from a true application. But there's amazing experiments of what's happening there, from a 3D printed pizza to order to, I mean, if you get served that's Instagram moment right there, right? I mean, how do you compete with that? So you've got all these things you can do. Barilla has a machine that actually prints pasta. I mean, think about that. Your own unique pasta made fresh to order from the person you take the order into the boiler. So there's going to be some innovation. This, and obviously, desserts, you see a lot of that. So I do believe from all the data and everything I've seen, in 15 years, we will see section of the kitchen operated through 3D printing of food, especially the things that towards the desserts and pastas, things that are high labor, right? High margin, high labor, but what kills your margin is the labor, right? It's high margin in cost. So it'll be interesting to see how that continues evolving. And this is one of my favorites. Can you imagine serving that as a kid meal one day? I want to eat a sandwich. So again, a lot of fun stuff can happen there. It creates creativity, it creates experience, it creates conversation, it creates sharing. It's a great plus, and it creates a buzz. The next one, obviously, is robotics. So I've got a different example of robotics. Again, the labor is what's going to drive it. There's only so much labor you can take. Now, doesn't mean you'll have a kitchen with only robots. You will have some supplement, but I think robotics will be much more heavily used in 15 years. Mostly, I think, will be in the kitchen. I think Wade touched on it a little bit. I don't know if the dining room experience is going to be dialed in, and we're not going to be driving flying cars in 15 years. I promise you that. That's the only mistake in my favorite movie, Back to the Future. They predicted way too much advancement. But again, that's an interesting one. You can see different real applications. What's making the adoption low right now is the economics are not there. You're not going to spend $40,000 on a robot to flip a burger or a pizza. But what happens when it's more commoditized, technology is cheaper, labor gets to a point that it's $20, $22 an hour, and then you say, well, it's a 2-year ROI, it's a 1-year ROI. You can start making lease payments on it, finance it through your bank, and it makes sense. So I think there'll be a lot of movement in the space of robotics. That's a bartender, by the way. So again, think about things that you don't need to experience, like airports. If you're like, I'm running through, I want a quick martini before I get on my plane, it might leak into some of those where labor can be hard and expensive and speed of service is very important. Again, you'll see some of that application hitting mainstream, and then obviously delivery products. There's a couple places in China now experimenting with live locations of different deliveries. Some are actually in a rail system. I don't think mainstream in the next 5 years. I think it might start being there in like 10, 15, but we will see more and more. Again, the labor market economics driving it. Augmented reality is an interesting one because it's such a cool idea and it's a cool technology, but my take of it is not going to be as much as a cool factor or innovative factor as far as that. It's going to be an accessibility feature. If I have dietary needs and I can point on the food and it can clearly translate to me what I'm about to eat, is there any allergens it detected? So the AI is getting so strong now in recognizing ingredients and breaking it down and estimating portions and dimensions. I think a lot of that is going to take mainstream as we move forward and get to the point where we're going to use it a lot to do things like translation, like Google Translate can do real time, but a lot more of those accessibility things like nutritional and so on. So I think there'll be a lot of movement to make it easier for that population that has the needs to dine out. So that will be a big one. Now, delivery is an interesting take. So obviously, they're all testing different delivery. I don't think in 2 years we'll have everywhere above us drones, where it's not that near. But I think as you build more technology and more competition, these will get commoditized. And that means that at some point, they'll be affordable enough for restaurants to invest in their own delivery systems. So that's an interesting shift, because the companies putting the money behind this technology might be building technology that'll make them less relevant long term. So that's something they have to watch for. It's an innovation that makes you less important unless you are the one acquiring all the customers. But how cool is it if you have a restaurant and somebody orders and you put it in and it goes deliver it? The ROI can be very quick once the economics are right. And again, I think consumer products are going to affect this more than anything. As robotics is happening more with consumer products, it's going to drive a lot of this innovation into restaurants. So mass production, look at technologies like tablets. If I told you 10 years ago, everybody's going to have tablets in their pockets that cost $35, $40 on Amazon, and they'll do all the computing power your computer did 10 years ago, you'd laugh. But that's what consumer volumes do. And I think there'll be a lot more in this. I think you'll have a lot more mixed venues, gaming in restaurants, gambling, sports betting. I think there'll be a lot of that. We're going to see a lot of this growth of the social environment. Will be a lot of experienced restaurants and that's going to build around creating unique experiences. So I think there'll be a lot of growth in what makes me different except my food. So that's going to be a lot of the things that are happening. And this week or last week, MGM and Buffalo Wild Wings announced their partnership with the sports betting into the restaurants. I think it's a start of something that's going to evolve to something pretty big, which is, what do I do while I eat? Like, there's a need to fulfill more than just food. So that's an interesting one. Obviously, we see it with things like that as well. This one is an interesting one because I didn't go exploring this, but when I saw the data, it actually made sense. If you think about what Amazon is doing, and use them as an example, it doesn't have to be Amazon. They're deploying fleets of these trucks everywhere. Small trucks, low inventory, multiple warehouses, short delivery ranges. They're carrying tomatoes, meat, cheese, dairy. Sounds like all the ingredients restaurants need, right? So as you zigzag across town, and you know that more money is spent in restaurants or groceries, it only makes sense for them to disrupt the food supply system. Because if you think about it, today you have to have big storage, big coolers, refrigeration, dry storage. You keep inventory that's very expensive in a volatile market. What if your inventory is only the next 2 hours, 3 hours? And through automation integration to those companies, it can constantly fulfill as those trucks crisscross the city and drop off just what you need. Fresh product, does not need as much refrigeration. How is that going to impact the capital expenditure to build a restaurant when you can eliminate a lot of those pieces in the square footage of a restaurant? Because the square footage is going to be very important in the future and how we use it. So I think there's a big disruption in this space that the giants like the US Food and the Cisco's better pay attention to, because hauling around 18-wheelers all day long across the town is not really economic. But they have the army to do it, and they have the supply. And as they're growing their buying power through supplying to consumers, it'll be very easy for them to make the switch and capture that market share. So Amazon, I'm singling them out because they're the most poised to do it, but it might be a new player in the next 15 years that will do it. But I do think we're going to have much less inventory, constant delivery, and like Amazon is doing now, delivering to your house, they'll have access to your back door. They'll have access to replenish. There'll be things to make it easy on you so you don't have to receive all the time. And tight integrations between back office and those systems will make it all seamless. So that's a pretty big one that was kind of glaring when we looked at the data and the buying power that these companies have and the distribution model. So we are going to continue seeing that. I mean, you can see there's a shift in protein in the United States in general. The data shows that in prior slides that about 86% of people that eat plant-based protein are not vegan or vegetarians. They're using it as a way to supplement and reduce overall intakes of different things. Some might be social reasons, some health reasons. So I do think it is here to stay in different forms. It might evolve, it might change, but we're not going to be eating the same balance of protein. Some of the models put plant-based protein as about the 4th or 5th most selling protein by 2035. I think the data is too early, but if I had to guess, it won't be far off, maybe 6 or 7. But it is interesting because, chicken had that big movement when the KFC growth, right? I think it's all them pretty much, KFC. But you can see that big growth, and that's going to continue happening. That's an interesting number. There's an increase, right? We're not seeing a decrease, it's an increase. So there's no indication yet. It's too volatile of a data. We talked about this a little bit. Right now, it's about $10,000 an ounce. I don't think anybody can afford it yet. But again, like anything else in technology, I think we'll have major implementation in 2035 that will have alternative to grown meat, from cattle, but actual lab-grown meat. So it'll be interesting. The question is will the palate profile of plants prevent this from ever becoming a reality? Again, too early to tell. There's a lot of other topics, right? I could have spent, as I said, a few days on each one of those. And when I did research, I actually went through all of these. And some of those are very small, incremental, not drastic changes. Some of them are drastic changes. The one in white are ones that I'm personally involved in. So for conflict of interest purposes, I refuse to actually show those here because I just think it doesn't make sense for me to promote what I'm putting my future on. But at the same time, right here is all the impacts that will happen. So I did this fast to leave you with some food for thought. I'm gonna hand the stage over. I do appreciate everybody. I'll give you a takeaway that this is what the numbers translate to in 2035 if you want to know what the results of all this slide is. A labor model in your restaurant that requires 40% less labor, a dining room size that's 30% smaller, a kitchen size that's 50% larger, and then the brand access is going to increase brand footprint. So think about that, which means more ways to get into your brand. That's not necessarily just your physical footprint. But that means, again, bigger kitchens, smaller dining rooms, and a lot less labor to actually fight off economics without population growth or income growth. So be aware of that. And with that, I thank you very much.